Good morning, everybody. I very much hope you can all hear me and see me. And it's very nice to have seen you guys all hanging out in your table chat before we get started. A very warm welcome to this session, which is on the role of supported and shared housing as a response to homelessness in Scotland. I am Beth Watts. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at iSphere. We're a research unit focusing on social policy, housing and homelessness issues based at Heriot-Watt University in Edinburgh. I'm the warm-up act, and in the next 10 minutes or so, I'll hand over to Anna Evans from Indigo House, and she'll be presenting her and her team's brand new research on this topic. Before that, I've been tasked with telling the story so far, providing a bit of background to this study in research and policy terms. So I will just share my screen. Great, so I hope you guys can see that now. I'm speaking to you today in my capacity as chair of the research advisory group overseeing the shared spaces research. And that research was funded by Homeless Network Scotland, alongside Action for Children, Turning Point Scotland and Crisis. And to support the research, Homeless Network Scotland decided to appoint an advisory group to provide guidance and input throughout the life of the study, in recognition really of, I think, its potentially pivotal role in this agenda and in the future of homelessness response in Scotland. So thank you to all of those involved listed on the slide, and actually a few others beside. Their involvement is obviously in addition to the very wide range of stakeholders who were directly involved in the research project, and Anna will tell you more about that in a moment. So in terms of the scope of this piece of work, the focus was on forms of supported and shared accommodation or housing. And we can distinguish at the get-go between forms of accommodation which have on-site support and those where the support is provided off-site. And I'll come back to some of the specific forms of accommodation listed here in the rest of my presentation. But the key point for now is that those in bold, so hostels, B&Bs, supported accommodation, hotels, they are the most common types of shared and supported accommodation used in the Scottish homelessness landscape at present and in the recent past. And in particular, these forms of accommodation have tended to are used primarily to meet local authorities' temporary accommodation duties under homelessness legislation, often in the context of stark housing access and supply issues and limited alternative options. So this is a graph, and it cuts off in 2018, but it remains stable or growing since then, as I think you'll all know. And what it shows is rapidly growing and subsequently stubbornly high reliance on temporary accommodation since the legal rights owed to homeless households in Scotland were extended and deepened in the early 2000s. And whilst, as you can see here, the majority of that accommodation, that temporary accommodation, is self-contained social housing, there is persistent use of shared forms of accommodation, especially in some areas, the red and the green categories here, and also some of that purple, slightly tricky other category too. And it's recognised, and I think you will all recognise, that to varying degrees, these shared environments do not reflect people's preferences about where they would like to live, do not meet their needs in terms of mismatches between the level and nature of support available and people's need for that support, and they generate harms of their own. And this message is one that has arisen very, very clearly in research undertaken in Scotland specifically, but also from international research on responses to homelessness. And I've highlighted just a few particularly relevant reports here. For our purposes today, the most relevant messages from this international and Scotland-specific research base concern the harms that can be generated in these shared forms of accommodation used in response to homelessness, like hostels and bed and breakfasts. So some of these challenges and harms have been argued, including by myself, to be intrinsic to congregate accommodation environments where people live in close proximity and share facilities. Other harms listed here are dependent, by contrast, on how buildings are designed, how accommodation is managed, how funding is organised, and how the support is provided. And it's worth emphasising the sheer diversity of forms of shared accommodation within the scope of our discussion here. So as one example among several, a few years ago, I was involved in research funded by Shelter Scotland, exploring the potential role of supported lodgings as a model to respond to young people experiencing homelessness in Scotland, where young people live with a host family that provides some support, but there's also specialised floating support as well. And we didn't find evidence of these kinds of harms being generated in that environment. And I know that Anna is going to share some other case studies and examples of housing provision that also appear to circumvent, mitigate, or minimise some of these challenges through careful design and management and avoid generating these harms. And indeed, despite this incontrovertible evidence base on the acute and widespread nature of harms in some forms of shared accommodation, there is a continued need for carefully, intentionally designed accommodation options for the small number of people for whom mainstream tenancies, with or without support, do not work and/or are not the person's preference. And Anna is going to talk to you specifically about the makeup and circumstances of people that fall into this category based on her research. So the very good news is, and this will come as no surprise to this audience, that Scotland's direction of travel in policy terms is firmly away from the congregate and shared accommodation environments that existing evidence so clearly shows fail to adequately meet people's needs and generate harms. So through the Ending Homelessness Together action plan, we see a commitment to and a pursuit of rapid rehousing by default as a response to homelessness, prioritising access to ordinary homes with support where it's needed, and enabled by rapid rehousing transition plans produced by every local authority. In the same plan, in the national framework, which I show here, and a lot of other activity across the country, we're seeing the scaling up of housing first as a response to those with the most complex needs. And I'm sure many of you will have seen the interim evaluation that was released last week by colleagues at ICEFIT. The Scottish Government has also committed to the extension of the unsuitable accommodation order, legally limiting the use of bed and breakfast type accommodation for all household types, albeit that the bringing into force of that has been delayed by the pandemic. And then finally, the recommendations of the Prevention Review Group commit to enhanced prevention to ensure that everybody has access to maximal housing options. Excuse me, printing issue, subject to strict suitability criteria, if possible, avoiding homelessness altogether. So that takes us to the way ahead. And this is it in terms of shared housing, or what we might have previously referred to as shared housing. This graphic is taken from a new policy directions paper published by Homeless Network Scotland alongside Anna's research report. And what it reflects is some of the discussion among the advisory group that emerged throughout that research process. And I'd really encourage you to take a look at that. It sets out a clear way forward for the role of what in the past we might have described as shared accommodation or shared housing, but are now referring to as housing with on-site support. So you can see that little red wedge on the middle left. So what are its key features? This is a sort of teaser for Anna's presentation. First of all, the accommodation represents a very small component of overall housing provision. Second of all, the housing models or schemes themselves will be small scale rather than large scale. Third, the focus is on housing provided with support on site, which is as self-contained as possible, but clustered or concentrated so as to make the provision of that on-site support possible and financially viable. Fourth, there may be some common rooms or a core hub where support staff are based, but people will always have their own bedrooms, bathrooms, and kitchens. Fifth, this policy direction has a presumption in favour of housing that is settled rather than accommodation that is temporary, putting control about the future in the hands of the resident rather than the provider. And sixth and finally, the accommodation will be of high quality and provide a non-institutional home-like environment in which people can control that environment and flourish with the support they need to do so. So this is a radically different vision than the current status quo in terms of supported and shared accommodation in the homelessness sector, by and large, some exceptions, which is nearly always in one building, with people having their own rooms but sharing toilets, kitchens, etc., etc. And it's effectively, as I understand it, a core and cluster model, as is already used by health and social care partnerships for other groups. So we anticipate the numbers, Anna will say more about this, being so low that commissioners will actually be able to integrate people in a range of circumstances that need or want this level of support on site, rather than just people accessing it via the homelessness route. So it won't be homeless accommodation in the sense that many hostels, etc., are at the moment. And this is where Anna and her team's new research come in, to help us understand the specific circumstances in which and people for whom this kind of housing is an appropriate option, the more precise scale of it needed, what that accommodation should look like, and very importantly, how it might be funded. And this, of course, isn't the end of the story. Homeless Network Scotland and everyone involved in the research are quite clear that the findings of this study and the policy direction laid out raise questions as well as providing answers. So we really hope you'll stick around after the break for the next session, where there's a brilliant panel who are going to discuss the implications of the research. For now, however, enough from me. I am going to introduce Anna Evans from Indigo Research to present the findings of her research. And before I do that, I will unshare my screen. So thanks very much for joining us.
Hi there, everyone. Well, it's great to be here today. This research has been a long time coming. Homeless Network Scotland approached us on this at the end of 2019, I think, beginning of 2020, and then we all know that the rest is history. So we paused actually starting this and really got going in autumn of 2020. And so delighted to be here today and to present the findings to you. So I'm just going to share my screen now, and hopefully presentation will come up. Right. Okay, so first of all, really just to thank my colleagues, Emma Dorr and Dr. Briege Nugent. Emma was involved in consulting with the most professional stakeholders, and Briege interviewed 54 different service users or individuals who'd been experienced, supported or shared housing, and had been experienced homelessness at some point in the recent history. So today I'm going to go through the research findings. Hopefully in your delegate pack you have the now published report and a policy statement that has come from the research advisory group setting out where they believe this research takes the discussion forward. So as we've heard already the context, but I'll just quickly go over this again. Beth outlined some of these key kind of policy drivers that we've had over the last 2 or 3 years. So the Ending Homelessness Together Action Plan, the original 2018 and the updated version in 2020, really setting out the policy agenda in Scotland for rapid rehousing for the majority of people that have experienced homelessness, or for those with more complex needs, housing first. So again, mainstream housing, but with wraparound support. This year, we've had the really welcome report from the PRG, the Preventing Homelessness in Scotland report, which is really, I think, important in terms of setting out the collective responsibility across the public sector. And I can testify to the fact that that has come out loud and strong from this research in the call for that, to have that collective responsibility across, not just housing, homelessness, but health and social care partnerships as well. Prevention being first, and emphasising choice and access with the same options as any other members of the public for those experiencing homelessness. And then also an important, for the client group that we're talking about in this research, is important to remember and base this discussion around the health and social care framework and the national health and wellbeing outcomes, which really has reiterated over the last well, since I've been in my career for community care, people should live independently at home, and that's now set out in the National Health and Wellbeing Outcomes. So independently and at home or in a homely setting. So just to go over what the situation is with the need for support for people that have experienced homelessness. So in 2021, around 50% of households that had experienced homelessness have support needs. And as I've said already, that it's anticipated that the majority of needs will be met through rapid rehousing, housing in mainstream or through Housing First. But the policy direction does acknowledge clearly that there might be a need for some highly specialised provision for, small supported environments for people for whom Housing First hasn't worked for whatever reason. And it's that highly specialised provision that we're looking at as a focus of this work, really to understand who that should be for, and what it should feel and look like. I just want to go over a couple of quotes from the PRG, Preventing Homelessness in Scotland, and also the Independent Review of Adult Social Care, because in this part of the agenda, the social care element and the health and social care is absolutely critical for making the system work. So the PRG acknowledged that where there are more complex needs that can't be met in supported mainstream housing, even with additional support, then the primary responsibility for meeting accommodation needs should be with health and social care. And as I just said, that's highly specialised, but that is not intended to cover the needs that might be met through Housing First. So supported housing is not for people who, for whom Housing First could be an option. It's where that hasn't worked. And then the Independent Review of Adult Social Care really reminds us about what independent living is. It's for people of all ages having the same freedom, choice, dignity and control as any other citizen. So it doesn't mean necessarily living by yourself or fending for yourself. It means having the right to practical assistance and support to participate in society and live a full life. So I think those are really useful reminders for us all about the foundation of policy around this agenda. So what were we asked to do? So the research questions, what support and shared housing as a settled, and emphasise settled, option should ideally be, and emphasize the ideally be as well, and to make a positive contribution to preventing and resolving homelessness. So the specific research questions were, what are the circumstances in which shared or supported accommodation is the appropriate housing option? What should that shared and supported accommodation ideally look like? And what's the likely scale of that? And how well placed are local authorities and service providers to adopt these housing options at scale? And I think just up front, I'd like to emphasize a point about language. At the beginning of this, we talked about accommodation, but as we went through, I was keen to kind of emphasize to the research advisory group and to my team that if this is a settled option, we really should be talking about housing, because I think accommodation, that word in itself probably infers temporary or something that's not in your control, whereas housing is more about a settled option. So how did we do that? It was a qualitative research project, really a consultation exercise, exploring with professional stakeholders, 54 in local authority housing, homelessness, supported housing providers, commissioners and HSCP leaders, and from the front line and national key informants, so from government and various voluntary sector experts in this field. And we critically consulted with people experiencing homelessness, 54 people, and we purposely sampled those with the help of the service providers and the local authorities to sample them from people that have had experience of homelessness to start off with, but also experience of supported housing or supported accommodation. It might have been temporary, because the majority of this type of provision at the moment is temporary. So inevitably, some of the people we consulted with had experience of temporary housing, and or who may need or want supported accommodation, supported housing. And it was a case study approach. So we the scope of it wasn't entirely national. So we went to Aberdeenshire, Dundee, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Highland and South Lanarkshire. And the purpose of that sample was to get a different range of types of geography, types of commissioning, types of local authority and profile of homelessness, and profile of approaches to and solutions to homelessness and alleviating homelessness. So as you can see, the two largest cities, two rural, and then Dundee is another city, and a kind of mixed urban area, urban rural South Lanarkshire. So what is settled? So this actually wasn't a research question, but it became clear as we started this work with professional stakeholders that exploring the concept from a homelessness perspective of supported housing, the definite experience people that were used to was that supported housing was temporary. And so we started having conversations with people about what is settled. And so here are a couple of quotes of what people believe settled is for supported housing as context. So it's about people can stay as long as they want to. They're in control rather than the provider being in control. But obviously with the caveat that everybody has to work to tenancy agreements, or whatever the agreement is that somebody's living in a property, whether it's occupancy agreed or licenses. But there is that concept of the person themselves being in control, and also people can move on to other options as well. So there is that sense of choice that people, just as other citizens, have choices about their journey in the housing landscape, that people move on to other options as their circumstances change. And so it's that sense of not being stuck in a type of accommodation because of funding or various other restrictions around it. So just to be clear, this is not about temporary supported shared housing. This is about exploring what should settled supported housing look and feel like for that small proportion of people for whom that's the right solution. And we didn't consider temporary or short-term accommodation, which is covered by other bits of policy, which Beth has already pointed to. And what is shared? So through this work, through analysis of the findings that we had, we've defined shared as sharing of bedrooms and or bathrooms and or kitchens. It might not be all of those, but it could be at least one of those. But if they're self-contained homes, and when I say homes, I mean a flat where you've got your own bath, you've got your own bedroom, bathroom, cooking facilities, living area, your own self-contained home. But it might be in a larger building, so it might be a block of flats with an element of common or office space in that building. Then we're not defining that as shared, on the basis that the housing element for the individual is not shared at all. That's their own space. So the first research questions: what are the circumstances where mainstream housing may not be possible or preferable? And that from all our discussions with professional stakeholders and the individuals who've experienced homelessness, it was most definitely around complex needs that we're probably all used to hearing about now. Originally from the work around severe multiple deprivation, small group of people with overlapping severe mental health, physical and or learning disability, and possibly also criminal justice experience. And the Pathfinder, which very usefully has just recently been published, Pathfinder evaluation by Sarah Johnson and her colleagues, found that those for whom housing first doesn't work, very small proportion, about 9%, where people have failed, so-called inverted commas failed housing first. It's where they don't they lack capacity. They don't have capacity to sign up to a tenancy or understand its responsibilities, or they're so unwell that they have very, very high healthcare needs, or people that don't want housing first. So in terms of the needs of individuals that we interviewed, the people that have experienced homelessness, we from our work categorized or created a typology around their experiences, from very high level needs down to lower level needs. And the people that describe themselves as or what we defined as very high level needs, but their description of their circumstances were that they wanted and they needed 24-hour on-site support. The on-site is crucial here for this group of people, and their experiences that they described in depth were about severe mental health difficulties, physical and or learning disability, often all of these combined. And when I say severe mental health, repeated self-harming or real difficulties in terms of mental health, to the extent that they weren't safe on their own. And that this quote here is from one person saying, "I need this support 24 hours to keep me alive." It is about to keep safe and keep that person alive. And that reiterates what the evaluation from the Pathfinder is saying, about people who are very unwell. This did, a number of the service users did raise questions about how their experience with services, they'd fallen through the gaps of services through their experiences, through their housing history, if you like, and how mental health and addiction services in particular didn't seem to be adequate from their descriptions and their experiences. So I think one of the conclusions from this work is, if mental health and addiction services were adequate, would there necessarily be a requirement for supported housing for some of these people? I think for some people, definitely, yes, there will always be that requirement. But if those mental health and addiction services were better, then maybe some people wouldn't need to think about anything other than individual supported housing in the community. So there was, from that very high level of need, there was different needs and support requirements, with different kind of graduations, if you like, of what people described that they would want. So some people wanted on-site support for a shorter term and then to move on, so a period of settlement and really being able to think about moving on to something more independent. Some talked about visiting support for the rest of their lives, so that could have been an option for them, could have been housing first if that wasn't an option for them. And some hoped eventually for total independence. So I think it's important to highlight here that it isn't, all or nothing. People do go through different stages of their journey, life journey. And it's important to emphasize also that young people that we interviewed wanted to be separate from adults, with perhaps with complex needs or difficult circumstances, because they themselves acknowledged, and the professionals also acknowledged this, that being exposed to difficult experiences from older adults wasn't in their best interest at all. So key features of shared housing. I'll start with shared and we'll move on to supported. So shared housing was most definitely a key theme from professional stakeholders, saying it's not an ideal option for people with complex needs. And so I think it's important to put that right up front. But it might be that for young people with low to medium level needs, that sharing could be an option. And that's where I think community lodgings or peer supported lodgings come in. Individuals that we interviewed, people that experienced homelessness, generally did not welcome shared facilities. and definitely not bedrooms and bathrooms. But from the sample that we had, a small number did like having some communal area, but not their own living area, but some communal area in the building to meet others with similar experiences and to encourage each other to move on. So in summary, the individuals with that experience said they liked having support on site, but didn't necessarily like shared facilities, and definitely not bedrooms and bathrooms. So I've just put up here one example of shared housing for young people. So Rock Trust provides shared housing for moderate support needs, and this is an example of community hosting where 3 or 4 bedrooms with a live-in supportive or flatmate, or rather, that's an example of peer lodging, supported lodgings. So the supportive flatmate is normally a social care or social work student who's similar in age, the other residents. So they're gaining relevant experience for their future career, and it gives them free accommodation and at the same time giving support to the young people. So in this case, the young people will have an occupancy agreement and they can stay for 2 years. And East Lothian Council, although we didn't research East Lothian specifically, they also have a similar project. But it's fair to say from the individuals that we interviewed, other than this type of setup, and we found a couple of flat sharing, generally sharing for young people wasn't hugely well received, other than this type of model. So key features now move on to supported housing, and this was these are our conclusions from all of the work that we did with the various professional stakeholders, but also the individuals that experienced homelessness. So it should be self-contained, and what I mean by that is self-contained. They have their own, basically their own flat, their own home, or it should be homely. And really, I think our conclusions from this work is that it should be their own home. Homely, I think, is sometimes used euphemistically to describe something perhaps in a shared setup, but making it as homely as possible. But where possible, it should be their own home. It should, where possible, maximise security of tenure. So ideally, so Scottish secure tenancy. Obviously, in the discussions we had, that there was acknowledgement that for some people that's just not going to be possible because of just where they're at. Or so the alternatives might be occupancy agreements, or in the case of community lodgings, then permission to occupy. If it's when you're living with a resident landlord, or in the case of peer people sharing with you. So, but ideally, maximising security of tenure where possible, and private residential tenancy might be an option as well. But I've just put there about a note about stability requirements from the Prevention Review Group around stability, where there's a suggestion there, a recommendation that there should be ability to stay in a place for at least 12 months. So that's something to bear in mind as well. I think culture is really important to point out here, because it might be that some organisations who are providing supported accommodation rather than housing in more of the temporary or homelessness sector might think, well, yeah, we've got blocks of flats where they've got their own, their own flats, and it could be, considered as this type of setup. I think the important point here is that the property and service design needs to be centred on rights and independence. So it's not a situation of, somebody doesn't have control of their own home. It's not an institutional approach, and moving away from that. That needs very skilled and flexible support, so individual care and support packages for that individual, and all of the individuals perhaps in a block of flats or some other arrangement. And the arrangement that we're visualising, and which many professionals described, and which is quite a common approach in the health and social care sector is core and cluster. It's a housing model, and it's a housing model with care and support on site. So I think it's important to emphasise housing rather than temporary accommodation, where people have their individual homes and there is a core on site, maybe the same building, or it might be a scattering of homes in a neighbourhood in close proximity to the core being where staff are based, care and support staff are based. And it might be that there, might be a small amount of common space, community space where people can meet and connect with each other. But the core and cluster definitely came out again and again and again from people, and particularly in health and social care sector, around it combines that independence. It's a very strong theme coming from health and social care about rights and independence, moving away from institutional, kind of residential care to a housing-based model with care and support on site. Has the benefit of safety, but also financial efficiency for the provider. I mean, many of us will know in this sector that in health and social care, there's some very, very large care packages that are going out to individuals in the community rightly, but it seems for some groups of people, this core and cluster model works better, and it's also more efficient for health and social care. Should be small, 4 to 12 homes. We had some examples of larger than that, but the general theme is the smaller the better, keeps away from that institutional feel, and integrated in the community. So that core and cluster could be relevant for a range of different care groups, and it's not about homeless accommodation for homeless people. This core and cluster approach is as relevant in rural and an urban situation. That core and cluster around a community with homes in scattered in a community might be even more relevant for rural, where in very small communities it might be that properties get stigmatized if it's a block of flat, for example. So that scattered option might be even more relevant for rural areas. I've got an example here people might have heard about, Rowan Alba. We did find other options, or other examples rather, with joint commissioning between housing and health and social care. This one I think is particularly relevant to the client group that we're talking about. So Rowan Alba is based in Edinburgh, also known as Thorntree Street, where there's support and housing for men aged 50 plus coming off the streets who have addiction issues and alcohol related brain injury for some. So very, very vulnerable older men mainly. Have difficulty managing money and finding it hard to live independently. And they're very vulnerable with histories of multiple and extreme disadvantage. 8 studio flats, so they've got their own flat, and 4 2-bed flats with a small building that's also got a communal garden. There is a canteen lounge for people who don't want to cook themselves, but the residents have all of the facilities they need in their own flat, full Scottish Secure tenancy, and so they can live totally independently if they want, or they can spend time with others in the dining room and the common area if they want to also. The charity Rowan Alba provides the housing, support and care at home services for the tenants on site, and it's registered with the Care Inspectorate. It's funded through a combination of rent and care at home services, or care at home funding, HSCP, and housing support from the local authority. So in terms of funding models, we looked at the evidence of what exists, and also with the background of what we know how temporary shared and supported housing is funded. And we've looked at the pros and cons and concluded on what we believe should happen based on the consultation that we've undertaken. If we're looking at a supported housing model, in its essence, it requires to pay for those housing costs, and that is through rent, and that's correct. I think much of the negative experience of supported shared housing in terms of rents and temporary housing has been around enhanced housing management charges that have made rents very unaffordable. And the HARSAG previous work around temporary accommodation highlighted this, how some of the rents are very high. But this is a housing model, and so it's correct that there should be rent and service charges. But the key is what is that rent, and making it sure that it's affordable. If it's a new supply, see there are options there, or a requirement if it's affordable housing for affordable housing supply program grant to cover that. And if it's a housing association providing that that property, the rent in part pays for the borrowing costs related to housing over and above the grant that's been provided by Scottish Government. Also, that model is true for council housing as well. There's obviously local authority housing support that has been reducing over time. It used to be supported people funding, but it still exists, and it is an option to put together with other sources of funding. And HSCPs, if it's a core and cluster approach in the HSCP sector, it's a common approach to have rent, service charges, and maybe some housing support funding, but certainly the HSCP funding for the care and support. And our findings are that increasingly HSCPs are moving away from residential care models to housing models. So, you have the secure tenancy or an occupancy agreement, depending on the needs of the clients. There is rent, service charge, and HSCP pays for the care and support. And I've said there again, there might be a combined approaches. We did find also examples of housing associations rent pooling, but that's certainly not something that the sector could rely on, and it's not something that all housing associations would want to do. So in conclusion or summary on that, there needs to be clarity driven by independence and rights, taking a housing model approach, but there should be clarity between rent for housing charges and HSCP funding for care and support. So we discussed with professional stakeholders the opportunities and challenges. Clearly, this is in some senses a very challenging area, moving particularly for temporary housing, moving to permanent or settled housing. We found some really good examples, progressive commissioning jointly between housing and HSCPs, and with evidence of savings created through that joint commissioning for HSCPs, where they were moving away from very large care packages in the community, centering people more into core and cluster approach, but still maintaining that rights-based independence approach, but with care and support on site 24 hours, which meets the needs of the clients, but also is a more financially efficient approach. The barriers people will be familiar with, siloed funding. Whilst there were good examples of joint commissioning between housing and HSCPs, there are still frustrations and repeated frustrations around siloed funding, but also siloed care groups. So people seen as learning disabled or mental health, or homeless, and these being different groups rather than acknowledging that they might have the same needs that could be met by same care and support service. Lack of shared responsibility for homelessness, although hopefully that will be tackled through the PRG recommendations, and funding constraint. Whilst, as I said, there are some good examples, there are still lots of examples of providers scrabbling around for different cocktails of funding, and a bit of an ad hoc and case-by-case approach to putting funding packages together. So it's certainly not easy. So the final research question was around scale. What is the scale of this? And got this very useful diagram here to exemplify what we're looking at. So in the qualitative work, we asked opinion about what people thought the scale was, and fair to say that people were saying it was pretty much a well-informed guesstimate, but the general opinion was a very small, but around 2 to 5% of assessed homeless cases would be those that needed, supported housing with on-site support. Nationally, that's equivalent to between 500 and 1,400 people. But the Pathfinder, I think there's the different evidence we need to look at as well. The Pathfinder evaluation suggested 9% of failures from Housing First, which, if you look nationally, that would be and 9% of those who might be suitable for Housing First. So we're looking at severe multiple deprivation type circumstances. So 9% of that smaller group would be only 315. So I think this is just the starter of this conversation about scale. That more work definitely does need to be done about honing down on what is the range, and looking at what the range would be for those that lack capacity, those with high health needs, and those for whom it's a choice that they feel they need and want supported housing with on-site support. So that's a debate that needs to be taken further. So just in conclusion there, the key messages are shared means that we've taken from this work is sharing bedrooms or bathrooms or kitchens, and in general the findings and our conclusion is that shared accommodation for most complex needs is not supported. It's not supported by the individuals that have experienced it, and it's not supported by professional stakeholders. It might be an option for younger people with low to moderate needs, but not for most complex needs. Core and cluster designed to maximize security, independence, and safety, but also financially efficient, would be a good model to pursue in one building or in a community in close proximity to the core, so that individuals have the option to reach out to that core and get the care and support that they need when they need it quickly. The culture is as important as the property designs, the culture of the service design. Get away from that institutional feel and move to independence. As I've said, we've got good examples of transformational commissioning, HSCP working with housing, but there are challenges as well. There needs to be that funding clarity between housing so that the rent is affordable, and care and support costs, so that there's that clarity between the two, rent and health and social care costs. Scale is small, very small, across Scotland. And there's no doubt that there will need to be a transformation programme here. Decommissioning temporary supported, which isn't fit for purpose, either converting that to something that's more settled and non-institutional. And it might be that there's some new settled supported housing required that could be commissioned jointly between housing and health and social care departments. And as I've said, it might be that the solutions could be integration across care groups. It's not about homeless accommodation for homeless people. Right, that's me. I'll try and get out of this.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Anna. I think I've just figured out how to give a round of applause on here, so maybe that's happening. Who knows? But it is in spirit anyway, and I'm sure for the audience too. we're still seeing your slides, but we're not seeing you. Oh yeah, there
Right.
Big round of applause. I don't know if it's just a process thing. We're not seeing you. Oh, you're back, but we are seeing your slides.
Right.
Perfect. There we go.
Got there in the end.
Thank you so much. So yes, we have time for questions now, and the audience can do that via the chat, via the Q&A, and you can type your question in either of those places, or you can actually say you'd like to come and ask your question or make your reflection face to face. It would be lovely. So please do let us know about that. We've had a few questions in the chat. So Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to come up, or I will. Anna and I can read this ourselves. I think there's a question here about local authority buy-in, and I think, Anna, this relates to your comments about the sort of scale of the transformation here. I wonder, could you say a little bit more about what you think's needed, or how big the task is in terms of local authority buy-in from your impressions during the research?
Yeah, sorry, I've only just sussed out how to see the chat. Sorry, could you read out the question?
Yeah, how do we get local authorities to recognise this? So it sounds like Elizabeth is on board with your findings. How do we get local authorities to recognise this and action it?
Yeah. Well, we found some examples of local authorities who are very much on board with this and totally got it and totally doing it and leading it. And others who I would say are some way behind. So I think it's like any of these, policy changes and transformational changes. It requires this type of work, and then policy statements and influencing in the sector to make change. I mean, if we thought about 5 years ago and Housing First, I don't think any of us possibly would have seen where we've got to on Housing First in the sector. So yeah, I think it's the same process: get the evidence and then influencing change.
Yeah, I think that's a really helpful reflection, both on Housing First and rapid rehousing through the transition plans in particular. I mean, I suppose in a way they give us quite a hopeful message in terms of how far you can come quite fast. I mean, we're not seeing the TA numbers come down yet, but I think we're seeing progress in other ways and can hope for that. But there is also this allied question about the level of transformation going on in this area on multiple fronts, and that could be seen as a resource and something that might help, or it could be seen as a bit of a barrier in terms of how much change local authorities and Scottish Government are able to manage at the same time. Audience members could come in and have and reflect on any of this if they wanted to. Davy Pentland, did you have a question, or were you just saying a nice hello? Unclear. Okay, here we go. We've got another question. So Vic Walker says, can you say more about the examples of joint commissioning between HSCP and housing? Very on topic. Any particular examples to consider?
Well, I think Edinburgh is a good example for Rowan Albert, but the East Ayrshire has got fantastic, and I haven't actually put that in the report because East Ayrshire weren't one of the case study areas, but they're very happy. I've found it quite late in the day for this research, but they're very happy for me to share their experience. So they have gone through a transformational programme with commissioning jointly between the housing department, accessing the affordable social housing programme, and HSCP, where they've got 5 assisted living projects. 2 of them are completed and 3 of them are in pipeline. And these are developments of between 8 units and 14 units with a variety of different care needs, people who can't live independently, who've had very large care packages, perhaps sharing with others, and now are moving to an independent model and moving to these flats where there is a core health and social care, pay for their care and support, and it's an affordable rent. And it is council housing in this case, so it's new build council housing. And they've recently won awards for public sector reform and health and social care reform. So I think it's a really useful example there from East Ayrshire. There were a couple of others that are in pipeline, so I can't speak about them because they hadn't had board approval from the Housing Association. So, but there's another example of an addictions resettlement programme in one of the cities where it's not a temporary, it's not current temporary housing, but it's inappropriate shared hostel type provision, and that is moving to a housing model, Scottish secure tenancy, with a small amount of common space in the downstairs, and the care and support being provided and funded by HSCP. So there definitely are, examples emerging of moving more to core and cluster independent living, away from, shared hostel type setups.
Brilliant, thanks, Anna. Rowan Albert wasn't commissioned by Health, but also in the report is that Health now contribute to that funding.
Yes,
to funding that
right.
service now. Yeah, okay. You've all got over your initial shyness now, and there's quite a lot in the chat. I'll have a look through, but we have one question, which is there one thing you think we should definitely not do when moving to this model? Any obvious, pitfalls or dangers in the path, in your opinion?
I think the obvious one is to guard against institutionalization. If it's a housing model and people are maximizing security of tenure, but if it can't be SST, if it's an occupancy agreement, this is not a situation where you're, chapping the door and opening the door, going in and telling them to tidy the rooms and get up. This is people are in their own homes, so it is guarding against that institutional sense of things, that if people are transitioning from being in that environment to independent living, that takes a significant transition program. Accept that, and that was noted by one of the examples that we found, where people with addiction issues are moving from more of a shared and institutional feel to an independent living approach. There will be a transitional program for the individuals about what that means for them and how to make that transition.
Great. So I'm going to throw 3 thoughts at you, Anna, and then hand back to you for your final reflection. So be selective or comprehensive as you so desire. So we've had one comment in the chat making the point that, welcome the research findings in line with their expectations as a local authority, but a kind of key remaining challenge is that this isn't just about homelessness and housing services. This is about a much wider response. So I suppose a question there about that cross-sector buy-in and what the key considerations are there and how far we are away from that happening. Another comment about follow-on support, the importance of follow-on support, which I think relates to this point about, are we talking about temporary or settled here? And my understanding is that we're talking about settled, and that the control over when to move on should be in the power of the resident, not the organisation, which I think is relevant to that point. John. Also a question from Jules, a comment that there's the question about how these services are funded, which you covered, but there's also a question about how the transformation is funded. And do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So just to pick up on those 3, I think those are really useful 3 to finish on. So the cross-sector responsibility, I think the timing with PRG, preventing homelessness in Scotland report is absolutely key, and I understand that's gone into the programme for government. So having that cross-sector responsibility is really key to making this happen, really, I think, and joining up between housing, homelessness and HSCP. Follow-on support, that's an interesting point. That came through from quite a lot of providers, and that the quality of support must be high and well resourced, and people properly remunerated. But also there should be the option for, if people decide to move on, that support can follow the individual and the resident, because that moving from support provider to support provider is unsettling, especially where there are high level needs. And services funded, well, really care and support needs to come from health and social care. Much easier said than done, I accept. And I think this is a huge transformation agenda. I think that the first thing is hearts and minds, and getting HSCPs on board. Many are, and others, there's definitely more work to be done. I don't have an answer to how do we pay for the transformation, I'm afraid. That would, I assume, go with the Joint Commissioner of the process, and again reflect on an example where there's a transformation of an addiction service to a new independent living service, and it is acknowledged that there will be a transformation and a transition required for the residents. One would hope that will be resourced by the HSCP, who are commissioning the overall project.
Thanks, Anna. I think if rapid rehousing transition plans, to the extent they're seen as helpful, there are some lessons there about the role Scottish Government can play in facilitating and funding the transformation work as well.
Yeah,
that's really helpful. Duncan has ended on a brilliant question that we don't have time to cover in this session, but that takes us back to the theme of the conference, which is really around choice. So can I just ask the people in the next panel discussion to maybe pick that up there. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us and for your questions and comments, and thank you very much, Anna, for sharing this brilliant research with us. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and goodbye.